Professor Lemish is here in part because of his exhortation that we should look to the Occupy Wall Street 99%ers. I guess I'm here in part to help represent the 22% of the profession that are public historians. Or maybe I'm here to represent the 33%ers if you want to add the 11% of our PhD holders who go outside the profession, even beyond public history. So, and I take those numbers from Rob Townsend's recent article, Perspectives, and it was mentioned again this morning in the session. And one of the points made at the sort of bookend session to this one this morning was that those numbers have been pretty steady for 100 years. We saw a series of pie charts, and the public historians and the people outside the profession of history has been 30 or 40% for 100 years, maybe longer. Just out of curiosity, how many people here read the Perspectives Exchange? And of those, or I guess others, how many have been following sort of the blog treatment of this? Okay. And then how many were at the session this morning? As we all know, the historical profession was having very similar conversations 35 years ago. In 1977, the AHA, the OEH, and others created the National Coordinating Committee for the Promotion of History. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. Its purpose, in the words of its first director, Arnita Jones, who went on to become the executive director of the AHA, was to find ways of addressing what had turned out to be a decade-long cycle of overproduction and underemployment of history doctorates, which had become known as the job crisis. The National Coordinating Committee initially sought out historians who had forged careers beyond academia. Along the way, they discovered historians who worked in archives, government offices, museums, historical societies, and elsewhere, and who, Jones said, had felt ignored or shunned by their academic colleagues. I mention this National Coordinating Committee because a few years later, in the early 80s, it became an all-purpose lobbying and advocacy arm of the AHA, OEH, NCPH, the Society for American Archivists, and about 2 dozen or 3 dozen other associations. And this National Coordinating Committee still exists today. It's now called the National Coalition for History. It changed its name in 2003. So the National Coalition for History. Today, that coalition continues to advocate in Washington for history and historians, and its main purpose is to call for more funding. In fact, I just came from the board meeting of that group right before this session. In the director's report, reporting on the activities for the year, that was the main purpose for the past year, was fighting for funding for history and historians. So not only has the profession been through all this before, but historians and their associations wrestle with the same kind of dichotomy I think we're all talking about today. Do we transform the profession internally, or do we rally to take political action? And for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to sort of treat it as a dichotomy, but I think, like the other speakers were too, like Ed, I think we can do both. So the National Coordinating Committee, now the Coalition, National Coalition for History, started off trying to do a little of both and ended up much, much more in the political realm, the advocacy realm. And where has that left us? The NCC or the NCH has had many successes and has never let up the kind of fight that Professor Lemish has called for. Year in, year out, the NCH and the AHA and other associations have been fighting for funding for federal archives and historical offices. The glorious fight can't suddenly begin because it has never let up. Of course, we can all try harder, and I take many of the points that Professor Lemish laid out. We can fight harder, and we can do more. But I think the real fight that hasn't progressed far enough is the internal, systemic kind of change that public historians, my organization, and others have been pushing for a very long time. The very kind of tectonic shift that Jim Grossman and Tony Grafton are talking about, and that others talked about this morning in the session. I agree that we can and maybe even should strive for government spending to ease the jobs problem by redirecting resources to employ historians, but I doubt it is going to happen soon in the foreseeable economic and political climate, and I wonder how long it would even help. What happened to those WPA jobs? What happened to the historians in those jobs? What happened to the production of PhDs, the training of PhDs after those WPA jobs went away. There are other things that we might try with more confidence and success, I think, and I have 8 suggestions. So how do we increase the demand for the work that historians do? First, our approach ought to be holistic, to look at the entire or complete system that is the historical profession or historical enterprise. There is no one simple fix. Creating more nests for panda bears will not save them from decline if the climate is changing or if loggers or developers continue to cut down the forests that sustain the panda bears. Maybe that's a bad analogy because pandas are so self-evidently cute and adored by the public. But whatever the threat species, pandas or historians, the way to increase their numbers is to address multiple factors and multiple interconnections at once. More food and nests, money and jobs are good things, but the picture is bigger than that. Affecting our ecological system in the historical enterprise is a larger web of former students and others who become taxpayers who will fund or choose not to fund our universities and museums and archives and national parks and history departments. Whether they major or get a master's in history, they'll buy the books we hope to sell, they'll pay to see the historically based films we consult on, and they'll visit the historical sites and monuments. Their children may become our students or may be steered away to more promising careers. As alumni, they help fund our institutions. History students and museum visitors and book readers vote. They become lawyers and engineers and politicians and government officials and business leaders who will hire or not hire, pay or not pay for historians. Second, to address the job situation holistically, I would suggest we think a bit beyond history PhDs headed for academic jobs. And other people have been saying this too. I know that's nothing new. There are about 1,000 new history PhDs each year. 10% or more end up in non-history, non-public history jobs. Rather than treating them as invisible or failures, why aren't we better at communicating with them, including them in the life of the discipline, AHA meetings, things that go on in history departments that they happen to live near or of which they are products. They are us, and many of them have ended up with experience and employment connections that can help other historians find work. Another group to consider is the graduate students who do not complete a PhD. Overall attrition is something like 50% right now. That means there's another 1,000 historians out there who may not have gotten those final 3 letters at the end of their title. Are they shunned from the profession? Are they invisible? I think they are. And I think that's a tragedy. Then there are approximately 2,500 new MAs in history each year. What's happening to them? Where do they end up? How can the profession further serve MAs after graduation, and how can they serve the profession? I'll get back to that in a minute. Many of us think of degrees hierarchically, with MAs far below the ABD, ABD below the PhD, PhD below someone who actually has a job, and that person perhaps below someone who has a tenure track job. But many history MAs go on to earn other degrees in law, in business, medicine, international relations, or they enter the working world years ahead of their PhD peers, accumulating capital along the way that becomes important later. They become the very employers and decision makers we might hope to impress one day. They also begin, also including MAs in the jobs picture is important because where master's holders, MA degree holders are now, PhDs may soon find themselves. That is, in a bad economy or with a surplus of degrees, obviously it means that employers can hire PhDs for positions that MAs used to fill. Okay, my third point. The real challenge is an internal cultural shift in the profession. That's really my major point number 3. As Grafton and Grossman and others have argued, public history and other career trajectories outside of academia should not be treated as Plan B. As they concluded in their article, Plan C, quote, "We must insist to ourselves and our students, as well as to the taxpayers, that PhD in history opens many occupational doors. If we don't believe it, why should voters and government boards?" I won't revisit what they have stated so well, other than to say it is congruent with what public historians and the National Council on Public History, my organization, has been saying for decades. What I think I might add to their case is to